Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Sorcher. I'm the Deputy Editor of PowerPost. I'd like to introduce my guest with me today. We have Vice Admiral Dennis McGinn, who served as the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, Installations, and Environment, and he's now an advisory board member at the Center for Climate and Security. We have Samantha Gross. She's a fellow at the Cross-Brookings Initiative on Energy and Climate at the Brookings Institution. And we have Rauf Mammadov, a resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. But before we get started, I want to remind you all one more time that you can tweet questions for our panelists using the hashtag 202Live. And I'll ask a few of them later on in the discussion. So I do want to kick off with cybersecurity and take it maybe where Dino, my colleague, and the senators left off. As they talked about, in March, it was the first time that the US government has ever publicly accused Russia of hacking into American energy infrastructure. So Admiral McGinn, what do you think?
I always start with the proposition that our energy security, our economic security, and environmental security are all inextricably linked, and they underpin our very national security and our quality of life. So anything like a cyber attack that threatens our energy security in the electrical or gas infrastructure is a national security threat. We have to take it very, very seriously. There's a lot of good effort that is underway in both the government and in the private sector, but make no mistake, cyber hacking of our utility systems is a national security threat.
And so what do you think? Is the grid safe?
It is. For the most part, it is. There are some nightmarish scenarios that have been discussed and written about in various places, but the grid is a lot more resilient than some folks would think. One of the things that's happening is distributed energy resources. This is microgrids, if you will, or alternative sources. We're not just dependent upon centralized fossil fuel generating plants that if they go down or the transmission lines go down, everybody's out of electricity. We're getting more diverse. We have a long way to go. I'm not trying to trivialize and just be happy and don't worry. I think that we do have a lot of work to do, but I don't see it as a catastrophic threat right now. It is a serious and growing threat. In fact, one way of thinking about cyber security is like, it's the weather. It's always there. Sometimes it's hot, sometimes it's cold, too much rain, not enough rain, and we need to be always vigilant about the fact that cyber attacks are going to be prevalent, and we need to share the information we learn in discovering and thwarting every one of them.
So Rauf, can you tell us a little bit about the landscape of digital threats facing the energy sector? Because it isn't just Russia that is looking at this.
Well, yeah, it all started with Iran, the Stuxnet cyber attack, and after that, Russia has decided to first attack Ukrainian grid in order to show the world, first of all, to show the United States that it can attack, and also to use it as an act of deterrence against possible attacks to its security, to the national grid. But overall, it's you have to look at it from the general Russian strategy of using proactive and disruptive tactics to undermine the global energy security. It's not just attacking American grid. It's not just attacking Ukrainian grid. It's their comprehensive, very situational, but at the same time proactive approach to energy diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. And unlike in a lot of countries, the energy sector here is privately owned. So how does this factor into the plans for securing the grid? I mean, what's the collaboration like between the government and the private sector here?
There's an outfit called the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council. It is participated in at a co-chair level at the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Energy, and is represented by CEOs of members of the private sector from all types of utilities, rural electric co-ops, investor-owned utilities, public utilities, and it is a venue in which there's a lot of dialogue. In fact, some of the members of the private sector, senior executives, have pretty high security clearances to be able to have the kind of targeted and really, really serious conversations about defining what kinds of threats are there.
Great. So on the innovation front, shifting over to that for a few minutes, there has been an energy boom, bless you, in America in recent years, thanks to fracking and other technologies. And so Samantha, can you tell us about the implications of this here at home?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I'm being a bit of the sunshine on this panel and focusing on more of the positive aspects of energy security right now, rather than sort of the cyber issues with the grid. The U.S. is now the world's largest oil and gas producer, or the world's largest oil producer for sure. Sort of take that in. That we've surpassed Russia and Saudi Arabia. It's just a really difficult thing to take in because it's such a different mindset for us. We have been a source of reliable, non-political supply to the global markets, which is really important. If you think about how companies here in the US make decisions, they make them based on a profit motive and an individual profit motive. Whereas if you look at some of the other suppliers out there, national oil companies, they have a very different set of motivations. And so this has been really important to oil markets. I'll also add that the fastest growing production here has a very different shape and flavor than large sources that we see in other places. It's very responsive to changes in price. Production comes online much more quickly. It also declines much more quickly. And so producers can ramp up or ramp down drilling quickly in response to price. This has actually taken some power away from OPEC. You've seen OPEC push oil prices up over about the last year and a half of supply decreases. But on the other hand, they had to bring Russia into the fold to do it. And so I feel like what the US has done in terms of innovating and increasing its oil and gas production has been incredibly helpful to global energy security. Not just for the US.
And Rauf, did you want to add to this?
Yeah, Samantha mentioned about the change of the power of balance in terms of the supply from OPEC to non-OPEC, but that also brought implications for the energy security of the United States. Since Saudi Arabia was obliged to reverse its position from protecting its market share to actually interfering to the market, it had to align with Russia, and that kind of raised eyebrows in Washington, D.C. because Saudi Arabia is a traditional ally of the United States, one of the most important allies in the Gulf, and Russia is unfriendly adversary in this case, and these are the two other largest oil exporters in the world and the oil producers in the world. Seeing them being on the same boat and interfering to the market, it kind of reminds us of what happened in 1973, the oil embargo. So that kind of concerns still are valid, and unfortunately we don't see a comprehensive and consistent U.S. policy, energy policy, towards diminishing that threat.
Did you have anything to add, Admiral?
In 1974, I was a young Navy pilot and found myself, after a couple of combat deployments, back in the United States, happy to be home, but sitting in gas lines. We had gas rationing for the first time since World War II. And it really was the catalyst for getting me so interested in this intersection of our economy, our energy security, and then later on our environmental security as key components of our national security and quality of life. So we need to be ever mindful, and I think Rauf and Samantha point out these key factors. There's always a threat, but on the other positive side, we have a very, very wonderful nation and a wonderful portfolio of energy from all sources.
Is there anything more that the U.S. can do, whether it's diplomatically or any other way, to get out in front of some of these challenges as they have ripple effects overseas?
I think that it doesn't take any Navy carrier battle groups or Army divisions to protect the sun or to protect the wind. And I think that the deployment of renewable energy, distributed energy resources on the energy efficiency side, demand response, demand management, and of course technology and prices of battery and all kinds of storage technology, including hydro storage, are going to revolutionize over the next 10 to 20 years our energy portfolio and make us much more resilient, much cleaner, and much more affordable.
I'll add a note on the rhetoric that we put out into the world. I feel like we've heard this idea of energy dominance coming out of this administration. And to my mind, that kind of reminds me of what happened in 1973 that my colleagues are talking about. Whereas when you look at the effect that the US is actually having in global energy markets, it's been overwhelmingly positive. We've provided non-political, reliable, and in the case of natural gas, quite flexible supply options to the world. And so I feel like we need to, in some ways, match our rhetoric with reality and point out that we've actually been very positive with our contributions to the energy world. We're not trying to dominate anyone. Our energy sector is not set up to do that. It's not how it works.
So let me ask that question a different way. I mean, circling back to the Trump administration's energy strategy and the use of that phrase, energy dominance. I mean, what do you make of the strategy overall? And is there a holistic energy strategy that's emerging after these documents have come out and what you've seen so far?
Well, I'll give one example in terms of to show the inconsistency of the U.S. policy, especially in the Middle East. We have changed our position on Iran twice in the last 5 years, and the implications are there. We'll face those repercussions regardless how Trump looks at it as a deal or as a strategic move. I think we lack the comprehensive and consistent foreign policy that will counter Russian energy diplomacy, which has been very precise and specific in the region and globally. And we'll hope that that confusion over energy dominance and versus energy abundance will be cleared in the minds of this administration.
One of the things that we need to remind ourselves is that the fossil fuel industry, coal, gas, oil, made this country the economic powerhouse, the military powerhouse that it is, and we enjoy an unbelievable economy and quality of life because of that. But it's time to change. It is time to accelerate the transition, and you have factors like if you want to put people to work, get them to go into the renewable energy value chain. We're creating 5 or 6 times more jobs every year in the renewable energy value chain than in the whole fossil fuel energy industry. Fossil fuels have been very, very good to us, but it's time to manage and accelerate as smooth a transition as we can into more and more clean fuel and affordable fuel.
Samantha, you look like you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, no, I'll add a note to that, just on the inconsistency of our energy policy. This came up in the first panel with the senators, where you look at our energy policy and we love free markets except when we don't. And you look at things like the NOPR and the idea of nationalizing coal and nuclear plants to keep them open. We definitely need to think about market solutions to these, whether we pay for additional ancillary services, whether we, say, do a carbon price that might advantage nuclear in a way that would be helpful for decarbonizing our economy. So we need to think about market solutions to this, and we talk a good game about markets except when it's not in certain interests.
That's interesting. So let's circle back to the Iran deal and talk a little bit more specifically about that, because very timely, Trump pulled out, for those who somehow missed it here in Washington, pulled the US out of the nuclear deal. What are the implications of this for US energy security, and where do you see this going?
One of the effects that's been talked about fairly recently in the past few days has been the upward pressure on oil and gasoline prices, and I think that really will happen to the extent that supply goes down by taking some Iranian oil off the market. It's likely that the prices will go up. The thing that I think is a serious concern is that if you've got a very, very complex multi-party international agreement and you have flaws with it, you try to fix it. You don't just blow it up and try to start over again. You need to be very deliberate and careful in trying to bring together a coalition of like-minded nations, as we have with our European, as well as Russia and China, in putting together that deal. And let's fix it, but let's not blow it up and walk away from it and leave a trail of dust and destruction behind us.
Tell us how you really feel.
Other than that, it's great.
I absolutely, completely agree with you on the impacts of torching the agreement. I will say that I think it will have some impact on oil markets, but there's actually oil out there to replace the amount of Iranian oil that we're likely to lose, particularly because OPEC has been cutting back production for about 1.5 years by more than we're likely to lose from from Iran. So I see a lot of problems with blowing up the agreement. I think it's horrendous for the US reputation abroad. Why would anyone ever cut a deal with us, given what we've done, not just on the Iran deal, but on the Paris Agreement? I mean, we've shown this real distaste for multilateralism that is very frustrating. But I actually think the impact on energy markets is low on my list of concerns.
Yeah, I agree with Samantha. I think it will be harder for United States government to bring other partners and allies to the table and to have unilateral impact on sanctions as we did before 2015. Back then, United States achieved almost 1 million barrel reduction of Iranians' export to 1 million barrels, which impacted the global markets. I don't think that will be United States will be as successful this time. But I think the more imminent danger is the escalation in the Middle East, the escalation of the military conflicts in the Middle East. That's a bigger concern for the oil markets at this time. For instance, there's an ongoing Syrian and Yemen conflict. There have been just today Iran attacked Golan Heights. Israel air-bombed Damascus. So this kind of escalation and transformation of this kind of escalation to military conflicts can cause imminent danger for the national energy security of the United States by means of disruption and other.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with Rauf. We are less secure as Americans here at home as well as in the Middle East as a result of walking away from this Iranian deal. That is something that is very, very serious, and we need to figure out how we're going to deal with it. The other thing that Rauf mentioned as well, the credibility of United States leadership depends on commitment and on following through. Do what you say you're going to do, and it has to be that way regardless of administration. There are key aspects of U.S. leadership that rely on us keeping our word. And in the case of Paris, in the case of this Iran deal, and Lord knows what else, we need to get more serious about speaking the truth and keeping our word.
And as a former military person, what do you think is going on within the Pentagon now and just in the agencies in terms of planning for the fallout from the pullout of this deal?
Well, the national security community generally is always thinking ahead, trying to stay ahead of potential threats. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis is doing an absolutely superb job. All of the uniformed military, General Joe Dunford as the chairman, all of the service chiefs, all of the combatant commanders, unbelievably great Americans, and right down to every private first class and petty officer third class that is out there defending our nation every day. So they are on it. But there are things that are political decisions that make life harder for them and increase their mission creep. And I think this is one of them.
Interesting. So I know that there is upward pressure on oil prices right now, but more broadly, the price of oil has been low in recent years, and you've seen it take a toll on countries like Russia and Venezuela, and other states that rely on their oil sectors. So is this the new normal, and are petrostates more broadly in trouble?
I'd defer to Samantha on that one.
Yeah, take it away.
Thanks. No, I'm happy to go there. In the very long term, yes. Mm-hmm. But what may happen between here and there, it might get interesting. I don't think we've eliminated oil price cycles. Mm-hmm. I mean, we'll continue to see that, and I think countries will continue to have challenges during those low parts of the oil price cycles. But we're seeing countries, particularly in the Middle East, who are doing a lot to diversify their economies right now because they see the writing on the wall. I'm not that old, and during my career, we've gone from talking about peak oil supply to peak oil demand, and that's a completely different world from them, and really changes how they think about how they produce their resources and manage their economies. And so, long term, yes, I think they have to think about this, but I think countries that are forward-looking are thinking about how to diversify their economies and move forward. The Saudis, the Emiratis in particular, have more concrete programs.
Yes, Saudi Arabia just recently signed 200 gigawatt solar farm which is, just to put it in the context, the previous largest project was 2 gigawatt. That's how ambitious their plans are. But at the same time, in order to implement these ambitious and assertive plans, Vision 2030 by Mohammed bin Salman, they need the high oil prices to reap the maximum benefit from it. So in order to get to that, they'll have to keep the prices high, and they have made a statement that their desirable price is around 70 to 80. It's not only to Saudi Arabia and Russia to impact the prices. There are geopolitical factors. Part of the volume cut in today's market is due to involuntary cuts in Venezuela, due to the mentioned reasons, and in Libya and Nigeria and Angola as well. But certainly the alliance between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and statements to institutionalize this alliance for next 10 to 20 years shows the intention and the plans of these countries to rely on oil and gas for at least next 10 to 20 years.
An oft-quoted former Saudi oil minister once said, "We must remember that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. It ended because we had better solutions to do the things that we've been doing with stones." And I think that's a good metaphor for where we are today in this 21st century energy portfolio. We need to rely less on stones and more on other forms of energy.
Interesting. I think that's a good transition to some of the resilience questions that the previous panels were talking about. What type of things should the Trump administration be doing to prepare for disruptions of service? And I know that Energy Secretary Rick Perry said yesterday that he's even looking at the Defense Production Act, a 1950 law to save struggling coal and nuclear plants. So, I mean,
I think the Defense Production Act can be a very good tool in government's toolbox, but how are you going to use that tool? It can be misused and not produce the kind of energy security and energy resilience. So I'll wait and see what they propose to do with that Defense Production Act. I think that anytime you can diversify your supply of energy nationally, regionally, and locally, that tends to be a good thing. I think it's really important for us to get on with rebuilding the infrastructure far beyond just roads and bridges. As important as those are, and we need to do that, we need to have a new set of eyes looking at our utility and our energy distribution transmission infrastructure.
So is coal a national security imperative?
No, it's not.
Okay.
Completely agree.
Samantha?
I completely agree. I completely agree with everything the Admiral has said. I would add that market solutions tend to work best in bringing out solutions, but what we have to do is make sure that we have the right markets in place. It's been really fascinating to me that through the DPA and through the NOPR process that coal and nuclear have sort of banded together to say you need us to be reliable. They both provide baseload power, but one makes a ton of carbon and the other none. And so it's interesting that they've become strange bedfellows. I'm a big fan of a carbon price as a way to sort of separate these out and understand what we need from an environmental and a supply perspective. But I completely agree that coal is not a national security issue. And I also agree that we need to rebuild our infrastructure, particularly because infrastructure to support a lower carbon economy will have a different shape than the infrastructure that we have now. And so we need investments.
So I said very clearly and abruptly that coal wasn't a national security issue, because it isn't. But we need to consider the economic impact on people in the coal value chain, recognizing the good things that I mentioned earlier that coal has done for this country over the century, really, and make that transition to clean energy as smooth as we possibly can.
Great. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. And if you'd like to watch video clips and other highlights from today's program, please visit WashingtonPostLive.com. And thanks to everyone here in the audience and everyone who watched online for joining us. Thanks.